and vocational education in labor reconversion, given the carbon exit. We have 2 hours, and this will be quite a lively discussion. And as I said, we'll be talking about industry and about vocational training. So I would also like to take the opportunity to thank those of you who are supporting us with simultaneous interpretation. Let me just point out that we do have 2 different languages available. You can see on the TRAJECTS channel, there is a link, as well as on the university's homepage, for those of you who want to hear the presentation in Spanish, and those of you who would like to join in English, please connect via YouTube. So those are the 2 options available. So again, on the TRAJECTS YouTube channel or on the UNAL homepage. Additionally, on YouTube, you can share your comments and your questions as you hear from each of the panelists. Welcome. We have 4 esteemed panelists with us. They're very diverse. We have 1 panelist joining us from Berlin, another guest joining us from University of Magdalena, which is as well as an invitee from the Technical University of Costa Rica. And we also have 2 women joining us from the coal mining sector. So the idea behind this dialogue is to respond to global questions that we have been rethinking when it comes to think about how we can be more integrated when it comes to technical professional training, looking at the carbon exit. We will also be hearing about the returning of land titles on behalf of the coal mining company Preco, and we will also look at the early closing of coal mines. And as a region, we are thinking about how to do this reskilling or labor reconversion through technical education. And we will think, when it comes to labor reconversion, about the role of industry. In the case of the Colombian Caribbean region or in other spaces, well, what role can be played as we see that coal mining is on the way out and as we see thermal plants being closed? The idea is to ensure that the exit of coal be competitive by providing appropriate technical training. How can professionals be trained? Or how can workers in the coal mining industry be retrained to work in other industries? We will hear first from our first guest, Daniel Lázcares. He is director of the Department of Technical Professional Training and Education at the Technical University of Costa Rica. So this dialogue, today's session, is part of a broader project being conducted by the University of Magdalena, looking at the role of technical training in the context of coal mines closing here in the Colombian Caribbean region. And we have been joined by Daniel in different steps during the project and in conducting a workshop with employees in the sector. And so we have been conversing about the role of professional technical education. Welcome, Daniel. Welcome to Colombia. Welcome to this dialogue on sustainability at TRAJECTS. A very good morning, good afternoon to you all, depending on where you're joining us from. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today. I am here to share a series of reflections with you. And if you'll allow me, I will now share my screen. We will be looking at a series of reflections related to the functions of technical professional education and training. These are reflections or insights that are very much focused on discussing a series of possible actions that will contribute to labor transitions Before I continue, I would like to thank TRAJECTS and University of Magdalena for organizing this event in order to foster these kinds of important discussions. As we heard from Andrea, I have been here in the Caribbean region, as well as in Cesar and Magdalena for a week now, and I have been here sharing, exchanging experiences with employees or workers in the mining sector. One of the central topics in this context, as we look at the coal industry closing down or ramping down, what will people do? How will they move away from this industry that has had such a significant presence? And there are a series of local and global circumstances that come into play here, which mean that coal will not be of such importance anymore. When we talk about work or labor transitions, we are talking about changes in labor relations. We must be clear on this. There are also modifications between the state, workers, and companies. When we are talking about an industry that has such an important presence, there are, of course, relationships, interests, contracts, and specific conditions that are created, and they have to be reevaluated in this new context. When we talk about labor transitions, we are also talking about movements within different occupational and professional fields. But we are also talking about looking to the external sector and other possibilities. We are also talking about reconversion in labor skills, because a labor transition can be an individual decision or a social decision, and it may also be conditioned by an external actor, also due to an external obligation, external circumstances, for example, a war or a company going bankrupt. When I have to leave my country, and when I have a specific profession and series of skills, and then I go to a new country, I have to reskill or reconvert my labor skills so that I can access a new employment sector. This has been occurring for centuries. But in the Colombian context, it is seen locally within our territories. When we talk about labor transitions, this could be something exciting, something positive in the sense that it can be an opportunity to find new opportunities, to also set off down new educational paths. But at the same time, this can often be a heavy emotional weight. It can be stressful. It's also a generational and agenda-based matter, so we have to be clear on this. So when we talk about labor transitions, we are talking about a lot of things at the social, cultural, emotional, psychological, and political levels, and we need to be aware of this. In any case, when we analyze these problems and these situations, we must be aware that there is fragmentation in labor and educational processes, and that there are also interruptions in these processes. And this leads to other impacts that we have to research. For example, chaos, opportunities, a whole different spectrum of possibilities. Also, there are new companies that can be created and new contexts. There's a very, very high level of uncertainty. So it may be that when we look to the future, it seems chaotic and insecure. But here, what we need to do is to research institutional support that is available, state and local support that is available, that are working to ensure that these processes that involve disruption, fragmentation, be as painless as possible. So to look at how we can connect labor transitions in this context, and looking at the exit of the mining sector, coal mining, and how this connects to technical professional education and training, or EFTP as per the acronym in Spanish. Basically, this is a system, a type of education that prepares people to make them more employable, to facilitate their transition in the educational world to the employment or labor market. So it is a training or educational option that is very much connected to skills that are required in different sectors and by different companies in a country. When it comes to the crisis that is being experienced in Colombia, technical professional education and training institutions are showing both their greatest strengths and weaknesses at the same time. There is a particular situation here, and it's interesting to analyze, which is how educational institutions over time, also looking at ways of behaving and organizing educational offerings, as well as the way that productive sectors' needs can be captured. All of this comes into play with a labor crisis and an energy transition crisis, as well as a labor transition crisis. Well, we must modify our traditional processes, oftentimes conservative processes, and look at, we can describe and characterize the needs of all the different social groups involved at the productive level. Especially when in Latin America, we have huge structural inequalities. And we have to look also how the economy and structure is connected to extractive processes, looking at social costs, where there are also environmental and cultural impacts. So this is not only about an technical professional education and training institute looking for employability possibilities, but here we also have to look at social development in accordance with certain principles and functions that must be determined when it comes to looking at the new relationship between companies, the state, and employees. And so in this sense, it could be said that some functions of EFTP, and in this case, I am referring to at least four, for the purposes of this presentation, there is a social, economic, political, and cultural function to technical professional education and training. There may be more functions, but in broad strokes, these are, let's say, the basic functions. What is the social function in this context? It is to facilitate the integration of youths and existing employees in social dynamics, as well as family, community, and political dynamics. This occurs, this integration of youths and current employees in this social context occur not only when it comes to knowing how to execute or perform a profession, but rather when we look at all the social and cultural elements that are present in putting together a curriculum. What kind of man, woman, youth, or employee are we trying to help form when it comes to the execution of a profession? In the field work that we have done with affected sectors in the mining sector that we have been with, is that now what kind of citizen, what kind of employees, Cesar and Magdalena, because here we have to think clearly about what kind of citizens and employees we want to build, so to speak. One social function of EFTP, which again is technical professional education and training, is to take into account people's personal experiences the experiences that current employees have had over their years of labor and educational experience and connect them with something that makes sense, that is relevant for them, not only in employment terms, but also socially. Of course, there should be social and economic utility to this. It makes no sense to conduct a 10-hour training course to update or refresh employees with regards to a specific skill if it does not link with a socially and economically beneficial path. Here, we should not fall into the trap of romanticizing things. We have to be careful with this idea of having startup projects or entrepreneurial projects. This should not be a strategy to substitute people who work with a work contract, who earn a salary. We need to be very careful when it comes to talking about the social function of technical professional education and training. I say this because oftentimes the function of an educational institution is reduced to fostering these kinds of capacities without taking into account the structural conditions present. For example, unemployment, access to credit, access to social dialogue. And so oftentimes this is left to one side. So how can we socially build or lay the foundations of what we could call decent work? So when it comes to EFTP, and so here we are talking about enabling companies to access qualified manpower so that they can also have better performance and continue with achieving or reaching the goals that they have set as companies. There are also micro, small, medium, large, and multinational companies. Many countries have made the mistake of offering educational courses that are only attractive to very specific companies in the industrial sector, but we have to diversify because this is related to territorial diversification. We've already spoken a little about how productive diversification and the demand for workers could also be based on manual traditional extractivism. But here this can also be related to, here we have to look more specifically about digital and other skills and how they can be slotted into the company. But we are talking about economies that have a very low level of diversification. And so when it comes to an institution looking at prospective studies and making new investments and looking at territorial mobility for employees, well, these factors must also be taken into account. The question that I would pose here we've had the opportunity to work with current workers and exiting workers, and we've asked them, well, what kind of model do we want for the region? How can we look at the characteristics of economic and social development in these communities that are impacted? We have also the political function that relates to the last 2 points mentioned, that this transition is, or rather labor transition is an opportunity to diversify productive sectors, the productive offering, by having qualified manpower. But in order to do this, we don't only need investors, but also you have to have a political discussion that is coordinated amongst stakeholders. You have to institutionalize the social dialogue in order to define local development paths. This is absolutely fundamental, and this is one of the political functions that professional, technical, educational, and training institutions can be here important actors looking at how we can foster a dialogue between workers, communities, and companies, as well as policymakers. So educational institutions are called on to lean on this. There are oftentimes educational institutions waiting for business people to come in and say, look, we need this kind of profile. But the idea is that we have here a Center for Dialogue for new processes and new studies with these characteristics. And here we have to look at how in this transition process we can incentivize support based on basic immediate needs. We have to look at how to boost potential new business. And then there is a cultural function. And this is a way of also fostering and really boosting diverse forms of knowledge that exist in local communities. Here we have to have a link between local historical knowledge as well as scientific technical knowledge. There is no contradiction here, because here we can create opportunities that are based on local characteristics. And so here, cultural knowledge is absolutely fundamental to effective transition. There's another cultural function, which is how through the building of new offerings, we can also question and build new values, norms, and conceptions based on labor transition aims. And for example, mines create and have configured a series of family relationships, different types of friendships, child raising, work days, conceptions around love, religion, care, class divisions. All of this changes. All of this will change in structural terms. But now the question is, when this vacuum is left behind by the mind when it leaves, what kind of cultural system will we be building? So to close, in conclusion, I would like to propose some general questions that could help us to have a discussion, which is how are we actually structuring labor transition in the Caribbean? How are we building this? Are we taking these 4 functions of professional training, professional technical training and education institutions into account? We need to make sure that we have public policy that will not lead to the creation of a lost generation in the region. We need to ensure that we do not have obstacles or difficulties when it comes to the transition to other labor sectors. And another general question, how do we envision our communities in the next 10 years? And what can Colombian history teach us about this question? What can we learn? What would a labor transition route look like? Thank you very much. There's the 4 functions that are connected to this context that I was able to become familiar with. It's been a very brief period of contact, but also very enriching. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniel, for your presentation and for talking to us about the 4 functions of technical professional education and training, or EFTP as per the acronym in Spanish, to look at how we can move forward with a just energy transition. I can make a brief comment here in Colombia in the just energy transition policy and in the reindustrialization policy, which has been proposed by the current government. There is very little importance placed on or reference made to technical professional training and education. And I think that when we look at these four functions that you have mentioned, we can see the true relevance of these discussions. These discussions need to be had. We need to look at technical institutions, the community level, and higher education institutions, and the government must also be involved in order to move forward with the Just Energy Transition, or JET, as per the acronym in English. We are learning a great deal here from the Caribbean School, and we see that we do need to recognize the role of technical professional education so that we can talk about what is fair and just when it comes to this energy transition and the exit of the coal sector. We will now hear from Marcus Eckelt. He is a professor, or researcher rather, from the Technical University of Berlin. Marcus is in charge of the Technical Professional Training Department at the Technical University of Berlin. We would like to welcome you, Marcus. Marcus and Daniel are both supporting us in this vocational education and labor reconversion process in the Magdalena region, so that we can see how to deal with the exit of carbon mining here in the region. Floor is yours, Marcus.
Hola, espero que aquí sí me escucháis. Sí.
Hello, I hope you can all hear me. Yes, we can hear you perfectly, thank you. Here is my presentation. I am joining you from Berlin in Germany. As Andrea said, I am Marcus Eckelt, and I work at the Technical University of Berlin. My field of research is technical education, looking more specifically at social and political integration of education. I think a little over a year ago, in February of 2023, I had the great fortune of meeting Andrea, and I had the opportunity to learn about the situation in Cesar and Magdalena in Colombia. It is a great shame that I'm not able to join you in Colombia on site for these 2 weeks of workshops, but it is a great pleasure to be here with you remotely, and I hope that I can visit you soon. And it's also fantastic to see that Daniel Lázcares is there with you in Colombia. And we have been engaged in discussions together since February 2023. And I think, as we heard in Daniel's presentation, we are talking about different lines of research, and they're very much supported by having different perspectives incorporated. I must say that I'm very impressed by what Andrea and her colleagues have said. It is great to hear that there is a successful proposal that has been put together for the Ford Foundation in very few months. I've been watching from afar, and I am truly impressed by what you have done, and I'm very excited to be presenting today. What will I be saying today about the role of industry in the labor reconversion process? In our context and situation, looking at Cesar and Magdalena more specifically, well, this is not only an academic question, but rather it's a very abstract question, but it's in a very concrete context. We are talking about an economic transformation process in the region, and we need to think about what can be done. Obviously, I am talking to you and giving you my perspective from abroad, so I do not claim to have the answers. Currently, in social sciences, it's very common to distinguish between different social spheres. And from this perspective, the industry or economy appears as a sphere that is separate to that of labor training or the educational sector. And this is coherent with our experience in Germany, and I suspect also in Colombia. And so after the first early childhood phase, which is characterized by engagement with our families, we then have a long engagement with the educational sector, first in primary and secondary schools and then in university. And then the employment segment of our life comes along later. And so we are talking about how to prepare individuals for labor. And so the labor market is based on also looking for the correct profiles that have been trained in the educational sector. But this doesn't stop when we move to the labor sector. And in fact, seemingly simple tasks require our employees or those in the labor market to use their creativity to ensure that the productive process functions. And this is to say that employees are constantly acquiring new skills based on practical experience. This is unconscious and it is based on routine repetition. And of course, there is also formal continuous training in the labor market or in the labor sphere. For example, training to use new machinery or new technology. And accordingly, the separation of these spheres is questionable when we think about how we are permanently engaged in education within the labor sector. And here, we have to think about economic sustainability in the long term. And of course, there are periodic crises in capitalism that leads to an imbalance between supply and demand, because at times we need specific qualifications in the labor market that are not available. And so the role of industry here is mainly that of creating the unemployment crisis or problem. And so in our exchange during today's discussion in this project, when it comes to putting an end to carbon mining in this specific part of Colombia, there will be an issue, of course, because not so many employees will be required with the knowledge. And this is quite simply because their jobs will disappear. Training programs for unemployed individuals are considered to be a response to serious crises and changes. And here we see there is a specific function of the educational sector for adults who need to acquire additional knowledge. The goal of this is to reincorporate them into the labor market, but in other companies and with new jobs. The reskilling or requalification of all workers is a process that will enable them to confront these issues. Here we see an additional role of the industry, which is the solution to the aforementioned problem. So I have been giving a more political and general perspective on the issue, but as a scientist, my role is to adopt a critical perspective of these opinions and not present simply on an ideological basis. In Germany, we do have experience with a similar situation. We have seen that there have been the progressive exit of carbon-based industry in recent decades. The first time this happened was the end of the coal mining operations in a specific sector 50 years ago. And then in the last 2 decades, an end to carbon mining in the rest of Germany. And so we have, of course, seen issues, economic issues and unemployment issues in the corresponding areas. And so upon the closing of these mines, many people not able to easily find employment. And I believe that in the Colombian context, it is not likely that there will be rapid success when it comes to this transition process. And that is why it is so important that the research you are conducting is so important. Research cannot be any substitute for the necessary political changes or material changes. However, research can describe possible options, possible concrete options with the greatest precision possible, and in doing so, create a more objective basis from which decisions can be made. From my perspective, this means that each research program that responds to these 4 points must be robust in terms of what's designed. What is the current and predictable demand in the sector for requalified workers? What are the specific skills required by companies? What funding exists for workers to receive quality reskilling or requalification training? And what are the qualification programs that are accessible in the region? These must be made accessible because oftentimes it is of no use whatsoever if you have a training option that no one can access. And so we cannot think of industry in isolation. Here we have to concretely think of the economic structures in the region and take into account the size of companies, the different productive sectors, the different legal structures of companies, and how the prospective companies that may be created in the future. For example, can workers' cooperatives be created? Thinking of Pierre Bourdieu, French sociologist, we can think here about different social spheres. And so here we have to think about the different actors involved. And we have to think about people's perspectives and plans. It's not only about economic actors. Here we have to also take into account external factors that are present. How does the state act? What levels of government are decisive when it comes to regional processes? Which social agents have an impact or influence here? For example, unions. Do unions have the option to have an influence on political processes? And education also has an influence. Of course, the economic structure will determine the profiles needed, but new qualifications and profiles may create their own demand under determined circumstances. So the question is, what qualifications will most likely be needed in the future? But I also agree with what Danielle said earlier, which is that it is problematic to suppose that everybody has the option to be an entrepreneur. That is not the answer. Here we have just some examples up on screen. It's not an exhaustive list of influences. I believe that this is a more empirical question when it comes to determining influences. And here we need to look at which influences will be most decisive in your regional context. So to close, I would like to share one last reflection with you. And this is perhaps the most German idea I will share with you during this presentation. Dania, Claudia, Andrea, I hope that you can appreciate this. In Germany, we do have a tradition of dual training provided by industry and the educational sector. So initial training and continuous training is oftentimes organized by companies within companies and is most of the time paid for by companies. And so training in this sense is an investment. In accordance with this logic, it seems that it is easier to organize training within companies, and it's also easier to organize requalification processes. So my question is, what opportunities do you see regionally to look at companies as possible locations or sites for training? When it comes to requalification for future employees, it would perhaps be important for them to be involved in work practices so that new skills can be obtained. And I think that this could perhaps be an agile, more rapid route for workers to be retrained, because here the regional retraining for the labor market would be direct. But here we must also concretely analyze the issue or question of which companies might be able to take on these kinds of workers, what training they can offer, and under what conditions they would be willing to participate, and what financial and administrative mechanisms would be necessary to incentivize this. That's all that I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention. And I do hope that my Zoom connection has been stable. I look forward to further discussion with you today. Thank you very much, Marcus. Yes, the connection was perfect. We understood you perfectly. And so the role of industry is very interesting. I have a question for you, but I'm going to leave that for a Q&A section rather, because we now are going to hear from Claudia and Dania, and I will have questions for each of you. So we heard about the role of industry in these contexts when it comes to an extractivist economy. This is the case in Latin America, especially with the coal industry. We're talking here about multinational companies that have, let's say, poor practices when it comes to social responsibility, and they also have poor employment practice. So in the context of an extractivist economy, the role of industry, and this is something that has being proposed in the new reindustrialization policy that was launched in December from the national level. It's only now that we are starting to talk about how we can reinvent ourselves in this context of reindustrialization, because in Latin America, broadly speaking, and in Colombia more specifically, we have been subjugated under this extractivist economy with the export of raw materials without proper design of supply chains. We will continue with discussion. Marcus, I do have many questions for you, but I'd now like to introduce Claudia Blanco, who is a trained machinist, the treasurer of SINTRACARBON Ciénaga, and also employee of CI PRODECO. Thank you, Claudia, for being here. I'd also like to introduce you to Dania Guzmán, who's a microbiologist specialist in environmental management and also ex-employee of CI PRODECO, in addition to holding a master's degree in sustainable development and environment. I have two questions for you, Dania and Claudia. First, we'll hear from Claudia and then from Dania. And then the second question will be first for Claudia and then Dania. So the first question is, if you could first tell us a little bit about the context of PRODECO title returns and the impact that this has had on employees as well as ex-employees that have worked in the coal mining sector. Claudia, over to you. Thank you for joining us today. So in CI PRODECO, started in March 2020 during the pandemic. And so the company decided to suspend activities temporarily and then later made a request to the Colombian state to start again with operations after 4 years, and the government responded that that would not be possible. And so the company's response is to return the mining titles. The Colombian state has accepted these titles, but this retaliatory process has been traumatic. because this has led to a labor and social crisis in the Cesar and Magdalena regions, where we have more than 1,700 direct and outsourced employees. And we do not include within this number informal employees, but all of these people have lost a source of income. So we're talking about people who had made their life plans based on their employment and whose families depended on the salary. So this has led to more instability and inequality in our region. Those of us who are union members have managed to survive. We are very aware of the decarbonization process. However, we are not in agreement with how this process has been conducted. There has been a real lack of transparency and clarity on the part of many of the actors involved. We have not been given any guarantees as communities or as employees. We have not been given guarantees as individuals who have been impacted by the exit of mining operations in the region. We have not been invited to participate in this closing process. We should have voice and vote within this process. So we are moving forward with our legal processes, and what we have noted is that the decarbonization process is not in fact occurring because there is another mining company entering to purchase these titles in La Guajira region as well as in Santander to bring coal in or to transport coal on train lines. So you could say that there has been a true lack of honesty here. It is clear that when institutions go and ask companies, look, are you liquidating your companies? Are you closing? Well, the answer is no, because they have not put an end to their operations. In fact, they have had profits. Many employees have been fired, and some of them have now returned to work, but in worse conditions, because oftentimes they are working as under outsourcing contracts, and so they do not enjoy the benefits that we as union members have. So we are waiting for the Ministry of Labor to provide the best possible solution. Many colleagues who are union members are involved in corresponding union processes, and there are other employees who are engaged in corresponding legal processes. So this is in general. So that's what I'll say in broad strokes, as I do not have so much time. Thank you, Claudia. Dania, as an ex-employee, would you like to add anything more? Yes. And also, as a researcher in the project, what can you say? Yes, of course. I would like to add to what Claudia has said with regards to the title return. Really, everything goes back to prior to the closing of the mine in 2021. In 2019, the company conducted a mass firing that started to generate a regional impact, more specifically in Cesar, more so than in Magdalena. This occurred because the company had plans for the company to conduct operations up to 2030, but with a reduction in their operations in 2027. However, in 2019, there was a change in the operations management in the Prodeco group. And when the new managers or management came in, rather, then things started to change. In one of these operations, there were some licenses that needed to be provided by the environmental authority that were not awarded. And in the dialogues with ethnic communities in the area, there were issues. And so a series of situations obliged the company to take action. And that's when we started to see these massive layoffs. And so the idea was for the ramping down plan to start. But these exercises were not complete. In fact, as employees, we said, what should we expect? What should we do? Could we have a map of what is going to occur? But there was not a properly established plan in reality. And perhaps they said, look, we have time. It's 2019 and we have until 2027 to do this. This is a voluntary closing process. That's what they call it. But basically, that's not really correct, because either you voluntarily shut down operations or you'll be forced to. And so this is what we were told. However, in the region, and looking at the activities that the company was able to conduct, or the efforts that they had made to provide support to employees, because they did have corresponding support plans, well, these were insufficient. Institutions have not required the company to do what they are bound to do. There has been no support from the Ministry of Labor. In Colombia, the closing plan has not properly been spoken about. And thanks to this study, this is the first time that we have spoken about labor reconversion and looking at the integration of the involved actors. Marcos talked about the role of industry, and I think that the ANDI is an important actor in this process, taking into account that the Prodeco company is a member of ANDI. And we would like to know what ANDI is thinking in terms of this whole transition, because as Marcos and Daniel said, the energy transition requires that we also think about a labor transition. We have to think about a productive transition. This will have an impact on us all. So who knows what Andy is thinking? Because we also need to think about industrialization of the countryside. It's also important to look at the structures that Marcos mentioned. We need to look specifically at the structures that we have in the Caribbean region. And many of my colleagues have had to migrate. And in fact, they've migrated to work with coal companies in other areas, for example, in Cúcuta, where there are currently coal mining operations, because their experience in coal mining has enabled them to continue working. But those of us who are still in our territories and are only technical employees, well, we are a significant number of employees, and we are here on standby. We're waiting. When you go and do these field visits, you see that there's been a huge impact, which continue to have an impact on extreme poverty indexes in our areas. In Magdalena, we know that this is a department that are already highly ranked when it comes to poverty indicators. And these are the exact regions where economic development that was offered by carbon mining well, it's now leaving the region and we see huge levels, or extremely high levels of extreme poverty. Before entering the mining industry, I always ask myself, also as an environmentalist, because I had the opportunity to conduct different environmental and social studies in the department. And so I said to myself, why do we have this industrial development and yet have all of these people who are still subject to extreme poverty? So I do believe that governments and institutions, not only the central government, but also municipal governments, really need to focus on both departments, more specifically CESAR. This is absolutely key, taking into account that royalties will or would enable economic development in the regions. And when it comes to development plans, perhaps there is a failure to think about how we can think about technical and labor reconversion and looking at technical, formal, and labor training. How can this really contribute to local development? Thank you very much, Dania. Sorry, Dania. These are very telling words that you have shared. I would like to connect what you just said with my second question. Excuse me. And so, what is the role of technical training in carbon mining exit? So you are employees or ex-employees in this sector. What is the role of technical and professional training and education in this context? The role of technical training is absolutely fundamental when it comes to the exit of the coal sector and coal mining, because this will enable the professionalization and formalization of existing labor for their labor reconversion. And here we need to think about potential future opportunities in different types of engineering, for example, intelligent or smart engineering, so that we can educate our leaders, so that we can think about who is needed for the energy transition. Both Marcos and Daniel spoke about the importance of technical education, especially in the regional level where we have scarce academic offerings. So hand in hand with the academy, we as employees and ex-employees want to lay out this path for the future. And if we cannot take advantage of these opportunities personally, at least our children and our grandchildren will be able to do so. The idea is for this energy transition to occur in a just fashion, for it to be democratic and participatory as well as inclusive. So this is what we have, the conclusion we have come to in our unions. And we've been working with the SENA, the National Learning Service, University of Magdalena, the Technical University of Costa Rica, Technical University of Berlin. Well, thank you for moving forward with this project. Thank you, Claudia. Now, Dania. It is clear that learning, training, education are absolutely key for territorial development. This is something that is not up for discussion. And in my experience as a researcher in this project, this has been my experience. When we started the Energy Transition Diploma Program a year ago, the Just Energy Transition Diploma Program, all of the learnings that we acquired in this diploma was invaluable. This was not formal education. I, as a professional, We are talking about postgraduate programs, more than 15 years working in social and environmental matters. So in this diploma, we looked at the whole vision and looked at the very rich knowledge to be offered by our trainers in this transformational leadership process. And as employees and ex-employees, everything that we could learn has been absolutely key. Then when I was able to hear from my colleagues, and we saw how the concept of energy transition was broadened and will continue to become broader. It's been very, very challenging, and it really moves us at an emotional level when we go and speak to employees and ex-employees, looking at their exit process. And we speak to people who have had to engage in very undignified labor conditions, because we are talking about qualified labor, but in the territory, due to local conditions, there is no appropriate work for them. And the term that Marcos used, requalification or reskilling, really made a light bulb go off for me. While it is true that we have institutions, educational institutions, and universities, professionally and technically, you might think, of course, that you have to be professional in everything that you do. But really, what we are talking about is labor and individuals who need to be trained in accordance with territorial diversification. The idea is that locals be able to be retrained, but we have to look at their skills, their desires, and their feelings. And this could be done through, for example, royalty resources that we have not yet received. So I think there may be, what is being done with all the resources that are being given for scholarships and stipends, where there is a lack of focus on the current real situation in the territories. So here we would call upon municipal administrations and departmental authorities to look at this. How will investments be made in a focused fashion? It is very important that technical education be provided as the coal sector ramps down, but it must be relevant education, hand in hand with the academy. We cannot have people simply sitting behind desks coming up with these plans and then having no idea where resources are going to be. Because otherwise these resources are earmarked in development plans, but not in a strategic fashion. As Marcos said, he talked about how there were all of these unemployed individuals in Germany. And Germany has already been through this, and it is not very different from the situation we are currently going through. And while they're here to support us as experts, we have to take advantage of their expertise and hear about their experience and their research. As Marcos said, research is absolutely key in these labor reconversion processes. As women and as employees and ex-employees, we have to start with ourselves. In the training that we received at the SENA, the National Learning Service, well, I'm a microbiologist, perhaps Claudia is knowledgeable about electrical matters and others, but we just finished a short training course in photovoltaic energy, and what we learned was truly incredible. And that's where you realize that when it comes to territorial needs, well, that's where we need to focus and continue to be trained. This needs to become the emblem and the flag to be raised and flown by our government and our administrations. Thank you, Dania. It's been fantastic to hear from the four of you. And now it is time to hear questions. I would like to ask Daniel if during these 2 weeks that you have been conducting research when it comes to technical information and education, well, Daniel, how do you think that in these contexts and in the partnership between University of Magdalena and University of Costa Rica, how can we truly foster this? How can we make it possible? Well, it is true that our research experiences in Latin America are not institutionalized, they're not strong. These are very disorganized. There has been more of a focus on, how can I say this? It's been organized in a more general way. There are not a lot of labor research projects, but when it comes to technical and professional education and training, looking at the exit of the coal mines, that's almost inexistent research, but that's what we are actually doing now. At the University of Magdalena, the Technical University of Berlin, and also the Technical University of Costa Rica, this dialogue that we are engaged in is part of building local capacities at our universities. More specifically, at the University of Magdalena, we are looking at the Costa Rican experience, the German experience, and the idea is to be able to come up with what Marcos mentioned at the beginning. While it is true that this situation that we are analyzing is not only an academic dialogue, but there is a real need here. Here, we have to look at proposals that have concrete proposals to improve employees' conditions. And so here we have to create capacity. We have to retrain our researchers also. We have to look also at having a proper focus for professional and technical education and training. We have to give complete explanations and recommendations in order to face and resolve these issues that are arising, specifically in this case for the exit of coal mining and the problems it creates. And so, Marcos, when it comes to industry's role and what you mentioned with regards to this transition and how this transition, how industry can benefit this transition to be more competitive, I'd like to ask you the following. This is something that I have spoken about with the Colombo-German Chamber of Commerce, as well as with the Colombian Embassy in Germany. How can we bring German industry to Colombia when it comes to the energy transition and looking at investments in innovation and energy, and at the same time, as the industry arrives to work on matters of energy, how can we ensure that there is a process of technical training? How can we make this dual training something beneficial to workers? I would like to ask you how this can be done, not within an extractivist model, but how can we think about this being done in a way that will benefit employees with this educational model? I think that what Dania and Claudia have said is extremely important. This must be a participatory process. And you have to look at policies. And when it comes to dignified work in the region, that's also extremely important. Of course, we need to find or look at options for Germany to invest in the most practical way possible. But also it has to be directly connected to sustainable regional development. I think Dania said this. You can have how is it that you have such a productive sector and such poor people? So I think that this is an interesting option when it comes to the energy transition. There are very, very large companies present. When it comes to investments and listening to what others have said here today, what I'm understanding better now is that at the end of the day, these large companies are also social mechanisms to organize people, to organize capital. But when it comes to creating a counter force, it's very hard to get organized against this force that in one way works against us and at the same time helps us because they pay us salaries. The idea would be for unions to provide some kind of continuity for workers and perhaps seek out different forms of retraining or reskilling that takes this into account and maintain dignity for workers. Listening to Dania and Claudia, this social battle or cause is a collective response. This collective cannot disappear, but hope cannot be lost. So that's what I would say. It's about seeking funds, whether these be national, international, what is possible, and launch as many production and training projects as possible with a very concrete aim, but always thinking about and including workers. Because, of course, you have to work to make sure the same problem doesn't occur in 15 years. That's exactly right. I would like to share 2 comments. We have 2 community leaders from the mining sector who've commented, and also some comments from ex-employees in the mining sector. Álvaro Castro, one of these leaders, says, I think we are lacking a social perspective. We'd like to hear what affected traders feel. Because as these companies leave our sector, they are no longer paying taxes and local economies have been affected. So we see productive chain being affected as these mining companies leave, and they are no longer paying taxes or royalties in these regions. So we need to look at how taxes and royalties and the lack thereof are affecting local traders or business people. Jose Moron, who is an ex-employee, says, yes, this is true. We absolutely need training. Carolina Garcia says, obviously, we are all clear that we must all have clear and precise information, and we need to receive as much educational support as possible in order to be able to more effectively execute what we have been talking about, because there has been a huge impact on the economic sector We need to trust in the energy transition because we need to take positive advantage of this. I could add that beyond trust and positive benefits, this energy transition must be just, and it must include solid closing plans to look at this labor transition, looking at labor reconversion, and also looking at how to prepare workers for reskilling or retraining. And also look more concretely at other industries. I remember that the former mayor in the Huagar region, where there was a coal mine, said that Cesar made the mistake of putting all its eggs in one basket. There was no focus on any other industry, but rather everything revolved around the coal mining industry. And when Prodeco returned its titles, there was a crisis because all of the local chains, and local startups depended on this industry. So I think that that is an interesting discussion to have. Marcus talked about diversity in the industry, and this also needs to be addressed when it comes to information and training. I would like to now please invite you to share your conclusions and key messages. I'd like to start with Claudia, then we'll move to Dania, and then Marcus and Daniel. Claudia, conclusions and key messages. In conclusion, and as my key message, we must avoid a repetition of the Prodeco case. I think we can still take action and ensure that there is more clarity, more transparency, more democratic processes in other coal mines.
There
are other regions such as La Guajira region and other areas where Prodeco is operating. There is the fear that this may happen. Again, we are talking in total about more than 20,000 workers who depend on coal mining operations. The idea would be to have more options for income creation. These closing processes should not be conducted in this fashion because the company used the pandemic as an excuse to evade its responsibilities. These are companies that preach that they are responsible, that they have corporate best practices, but when we look at the reality, employees, the communities, as well as the local environment, all of us who've been affected by mining operations, we see that there is a complete lack of coherence between what they say and what they do. And so it is extremely important that we have participation from all interested parties, stakeholders, and affected parties. As I already said, community, academy, government, companies, employees, local businesses. We must all work together so that this energy transition is not so traumatic. We do not want to see this occur in a negative fashion, but rather we want to see a better future for us all. And so SINCARBON, SINTRACARBON, SINTRACODECO, we are all here ready to work with all stakeholders in a social dialogue so that things can be done in the best way possible. Because this must be a just energy transition for local workers. And here we must work with industry because things cannot be done as they have been done in our case. Thank you very much for the invitation and for listening to me. because sometimes things are not given the importance that they should be. Thank you very much, Claudia, for joining. As an ex-employee of the the coal mine, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. Dania, over to you. So first off, I would like to thank all participants for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here at this event. This dialogue, well, that's what this is really about, right? When we have dialogue, that's when we can really determine criteria, come up with actions, and make good decisions. And when it comes to working with institutions, with ministries, with all the different stakeholders, well, we must all be involved in this energy transition process. And when it comes to labor reconversion, we must all have a seat at the table. We know that everybody's engaged in dialogue from their own perspectives and spaces, talking about the energy transition. But this must be a dialogue based on consensus. Just a little while ago, we heard that there was a forum to talk about the coal sector, the energy transition, and there will be another forum held on the energy transition, looking at renewable energies. So these are dialogues that are being held in isolation. So what we would request is that the different institutions involved, such as the Academy, also invite us or use the platforms to engage with other stakeholders. National policy on energy transition says clearly in one of its paragraphs that the energy transition in Colombia seeks to close gaps. But they say that gaps will be closed more specifically for women with regards to gender equity, and that as women, we will be the main point of focus as we have been left out of these processes. And while the coal sector is a very masculine industry, we see that renewable energies, solar energy, for example, are also very masculinized sectors. So what I believe it is necessary is that the actions being taken be properly looked at to see how we can be included and gaps can truly be closed. While conditions in the sectors where energy is produced, for example, mining, as well as coal transport, this is always occurring in rural areas. And poverty, most extreme poverty, is seen amongst women in rural areas in Colombia. So we must rethink from an industrial perspective about how to industrialize the countryside, but doing so in a fashion such that women have the capacity to insert themselves in these reindustrialization processes being conducted in the countryside. One way or another, these motivations must be fostered. Education cannot be something that is distant or out of reach. It must be within everybody's reach. What we've constantly heard is that, look, I could study, but I don't have enough money to do so. Or I can't access the course that I want to study because it's offered in another city. And so people have to think about going to Bucaramanga or another city. But really, we could be offering these educational opportunities close by in our local territories so that people can work and study at the same time. Marco said something key. Industry and companies within their processes seek to have their employees receive training. And so when we we work in companies, the idea is for us to leave with strength and skills. And so in the Caribbean region, those companies that are present here in our region should also adopt this perspective for current employees and former employees in the sector. They should not focus only on having productivity, but rather on having a qualified and trained labor force, so that they can be as competitive as possible and have the best performance possible. We saw this in Prodeco, that training was constantly offered, but everything was about standard policies and compliance. We could see that the focus was on production, but really, in the creation of new companies, we also need training, because new companies will be created, but how we receive training. So that would be my request, my invitation for this perspective to be revised and look at whether or not gaps are truly being closed, and if a consensual and coordinated dialogue can truly be conducted to ensure a just energy transition that we all desire, so that we truly benefit our territories, not only economically and in productive terms, but also looking at social aspects and also from the family perspective. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dania. Marcus, your conclusions and key messages. Yes, thank you for inviting me to participate. So something key from today is that we are talking about a political process, not an economic process. We have to think about businesses' actions, and these are political issues. We must think about individual and collective impacts. There are people who have made decisions, and it is their responsibility to deal with this situation. It's not the individual's responsibility. We must aspire to a better future for youths and for families, as has been said. Oftentimes, people are more motivated by their children's possible futures than their own direct futures. We must look at policy to ensure that it can secure this kind of development. The other thing I would highlight is that this is a painful process for individuals and for groups. We have to think about how to channel this pain so that it can be something productive and not destructive. And lastly, if you are interested, I would very much like to continue with this exchange, and in doing so, perhaps look for possibilities for more concrete projects in the future. Look at how we can combine renewable energies and professional training in one project. I think that would be absolutely key based on what you have said today. And look at, for example, if there is funding available in Germany that could help with that. And I would be very much interested in doing so. Thank you very much, Marcus. And I couldn't agree more. We are very, very excited. All of your knowledge and where we are headed as a territory will surely be very enriching, and the idea is to continue this project not only this year, but also in the future. And we must strengthen research in Latin America. So I couldn't agree more. We must continue and continue to foster this collaboration. Okay, Daniel, you now have the enormous task of closing. You have been here in Colombia now for a couple of weeks, and you've also, of course, learned through this dialogue. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you. I am going to try to highlight a couple of points that were mentioned by Claudia, Dania, and Marcos, and connect these directly to my experience with these communities. The first point is that the decision for a company to set up operations in a territory is not only an economic decision, but it's also a political decision. It is the result of negotiations between institutions. Many different political negotiations occur. The point is who controls what is discussed in those negotiations. I think that the content of political negotiations for new investments when it comes to attracting new economic and social projects, as Dania said, must be a matter of consensus, looking at the problems that, of course, existed before we knew that carbon mines were going to close. So when it comes to the issues related to water, access problems, etc., well, there are conditions that are absolutely fundamental for a company to make the decision to set up operations in these territories or not. So we already had social, economic, and infrastructure problems, and this energy transition and labor transition process must be taken advantage of to highlight these problems, go back to the drawing board and analyze these pre-existing problems. That is one of the first conclusions I would like to offer, which is really the backdrop to how new economic, labor, and productive understanding dynamics will be instituted, looking at having fair salaries, gender equity, decent work hours with care for raw materials, and also looking at providing technologically advanced services, etc. And we will determine that. Secondly, we must have an institutionalized dialogue to achieve this. But oftentimes what happens is that we don't know who's responsible for doing that. We say, look, the state should do that, the municipality should do it, the ministry has to do it, it should be the SENA or National Learning Service, it should be the universities that do it. These kinds of academic, scientific projects with a calling to take social actions are usually the epicenter of actions to be taken, and they also define not only scientific lobbying activities via data analysis, but we can also carry out political lobbying through these initiatives. And so, as Claudia said, it is important to look at the historical context and that exist in the Magdalena and Cesar departments so that we can come together and really create new social forces and groups and take full advantage of the project being carried out or conducted by the university. When it comes to informal employment or unemployment, inequality that characterize our society, these must be seen as an opportunity. And so in Magdalena and Cesar, we must look at how to rectify social structure issues. We have to look also at what are the legacies that will be left by mining activity in environmental terms, the impact also on livestock and fishing. And so I think that we need to take a very, very in-depth look at people's vocational abilities. This requires that we raise awareness subjectively and intersubjectively at a collective level, looking at vocational, professional, creative, and dynamic skills that all of us possess to make do while educational institutions, while the Ministry of Economy, and while business chambers make decisions with regards to a political and economic plan. Because we, of course, have to be clear on the impact of the exit of the coal mining sector in Magdalena. And it's about coordination between communities that exist in different contexts, that have different technical capacities, professionals that have different abilities when it comes to art, music, and institutional capacities, etc. I am very grateful for this experience. It has been a great privilege to be in these communities for the last 2 weeks, working with a research group and working with exiting employees, former employees, and current employees. And I think that TRAJECTS is absolutely key for a Latin American context to centralize these efforts. Thank you very much. And we will, of course, continue to work together cooperatively. Absolutely, we must continue to work together. And thank you to TRAJECTS for this space, for this dialogue on sustainability, with a specific focus on the role of industry and vocational education, as well as technical and professional training and education. Thank you very much, Marcos, for joining us from Berlin. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us for the last 2 weeks out in the field. Thank you for creating knowledge and thinking about the carbon sector exit. Thank you, Claudia Blanco, for joining us to share your experience working in CI PRODECO and who is now engaged in the union process and closing of coal mines. Also, thank you, Dania Guzmán, who is a former employee of CI PRODECO and who is also a researcher in our project looking at vocational education and labor reconversion. Of course, we still have many pending questions, feelings, and also an enormous desire to continue this work. Thank you to all of those who have joined us virtually. We were planning to have an on-site event, but the National Civic Day was declared today because in Latin America and Colombia, we are suffering due to the El Niño weather pattern. And so we will have a possible power cut, and we are also having some issues with our water levels in dams that provide energy in Bogota and around Colombia. And accordingly, President Petro decreed today's Civic Day so that we can all try to save energy and water. The University of Magdalena made the decision to celebrate this Civic Day. We have closed down on-site operations, and that's why we are all joining today virtually. And thank you for enabling this continued remote dialogue. Thank you to our interpretation team, and thank you to the University of Magdalena, and thank you to the research team joining us, and that has joined us for the last 2 weeks. Also, thanks to those of you joining us from the university incubator research team. Thank you. This dialogue will continue. This project will continue. Thank you very much, and everybody have a fantastic day.